Paul Newman spent 50 years being called Hollywood's most devoted husband. Those piercing blue eyes, that easy charm, one of the most beloved leading men Hollywood ever produced. But the two women who shared his life both met endings far sadder than anything he ever put on screen. One vanished from public life, carrying a secret to her grave no one has explained. The other lost the very memory of their love story in the cruelest way imaginable. Stick around, because both stories deserve to be told. The making of a movie star. Before the fame, before the Oscar, and before either marriage, Paul Newman was simply a young man from Shaker Heights, Ohio, trying to figure out what to do with his life. He was born on January 26, 1925, to a Jewish father who ran a successful sporting goods store and a Catholic mother of Slovak descent, growing up in a comfortable, middle-class household that gave little early indication of the extraordinary fame that awaited him. As a teenager, he showed an interest in performing, but it was far from a clear path forward, especially once the Second World War interrupted whatever plans he might have been forming. His childhood in Ohio was, by most accounts, fairly conventional for a boy of his era, marked by an early love of sports and a quiet curiosity that occasionally led him toward the local theatre scene, though nothing about those early years suggested the trajectory his life would eventually take. His father's sporting goods business provided a stable, comfortable upbringing, and there was, at least initially, some expectation within the family that Paul might eventually take over the business himself, an assumption that the pull of acting would ultimately overturn entirely. Classmates and early acquaintances later recalled him as personable and quick-witted, even as a young man, qualities that would later translate seamlessly onto the screen once he finally found his way into professional acting. Newman enlisted in the United States Navy in 1943, training as a radio man and gunner, and eventually serving in the Pacific Theater aboard torpedo bombers during some of the war's final and most dangerous campaigns. The experience of serving during wartime, particularly during some of the most intense fighting of the Pacific Campaign, left a lasting impression on him, one that friends and biographers later suggested shaped his lifelong sense of discipline and his eventual passion for competitive auto racing, a pursuit that would become a defining part of his life outside the film industry in later decades. He rarely spoke publicly in great detail about his wartime service, but those who knew him well often pointed to those years as a formative influence on the quiet, understated toughness that would later become one of his defining traits, both on screen and in his private life. After the war ended, he returned home and enrolled at Kenyon College in Ohio, where he studied economics and drama, discovering along the way that acting held a pull on him that no other career path quite matched. He originally enrolled with vague ambitions of eventually joining the family business, but a chance involvement with the college's drama program quickly reoriented his entire sense of what he wanted his life to become. He went on to study further at Yale University and later at the famous Actors Studio in New York City, sharpening his craft alongside a generation of performers who would go on to reshape American film and theatre, including future collaborators and contemporaries who would remain part of his professional circle for decades to come. Those years of formal training gave him a grounding in technique and craft that would serve him throughout a career spanning more than 5 decades, distinguishing him from performers who relied purely on natural charisma without the same depth of dramatic study behind it. It was during these early years of striving and uncertainty, long before anyone recognized his name, that Newman met the woman who would become his first wife, a fellow young performer chasing her own dreams in the competitive, unpredictable world of American theatre. A marriage born in summer stock. In the summer of 1949, Newman was working summer stock theatre when he met a young, aspiring actress named Jacqueline Vita, known to everyone as Jackie. She was just 19 years old at the time, a tall, striking blonde with dark eyes who had not yet finished college, while Newman, a 24-year-old Navy veteran, was only just beginning to imagine a real career for himself on the stage. The two fell for each other quickly amid the whirlwind atmosphere of summer theatre, and within just a few months, they had decided to marry. Jackie had grown up the daughter of a meat market owner, raised in a family that valued stability and tradition, values that stood in some contrast to the unpredictable, itinerant life that came with pursuing a career in professional theatre. On December 27th, 1949, Paul Newman and Jackie Witt were married at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Beloit, Wisconsin, close to where Jackie's family was based. It was, by most accounts, a hopeful and happy beginning. Two young performers building a life together while Newman continued chasing his still uncertain acting career. Not long after the wedding, Jackie became pregnant, and in 1950, the couple welcomed their first child, a son they named Scott. Two daughters followed in the years afterward: Susan Kendall, born in 1953, and Stephanie, born in 1954, rounding out a family of 5 living in Staten Island, New York, while Newman worked to establish himself in an industry that offered no guarantees of success. As the family grew, Jackie made the decision to set aside her own acting ambitions almost entirely, focusing instead on raising the children and managing the household, while her husband pursued the uncertain and often unstable life of a working actor. She became, by every account available, a devoted and hands-on mother, someone who found genuine purpose in homemaking, even as the spotlight remained fixed almost entirely on her husband's rising career. Those early years in Staten Island were, by most descriptions, modest and unglamorous. A young family scraping by on the uncertain income of an actor still years away from his eventual breakthrough. A far cry from the extraordinary wealth and fame that would later come to define the Newman name. It was a role many women of her generation stepped into without complaint, but it was a role that would soon be tested in ways Jackie could never have anticipated, starting with a Broadway rehearsal room in 1953. The Broadway play that changed everything. In 1953, Newman landed a role in the Broadway production of the play Picnic, and it was there that he first crossed paths with a talented young actress named Joanne Woodward, who was working as an understudy in the same production. Joanne, born on February 27, 1930, in Thomasville, Georgia, had already built a reputation within New York theater circles as a serious and gifted performer, and the two quickly developed a close working relationship that, over time, deepened into something far more complicated than simple professional camaraderie. Joanne had come to New York with a clear sense of purpose, having studied at Louisiana State University and later at Neighborhood Playhouse, determined to build a serious acting career on her own terms, rather than simply chasing glamour or celebrity. A determination that set her apart from many of the young actresses she competed against for roles in that era's crowded New York theater scene. At the time, Newman was still married to Jackie and raising 2 young children, with a third on the way, and by most accounts, he did not pursue anything improper with Joanne during these earliest years of their acquaintance. Still, the connection between them was evident to those who worked alongside them, a spark of creative and personal chemistry that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year, even as Newman continued attempting to maintain his family life at home in Staten Island. Friends who knew the couple at the time later described Jackie as shy and private by nature, a stark contrast to the more outgoing, socially confident circles that Newman found himself increasingly drawn toward as his career began to take off. Circles that included the kind of writers, directors, and fellow performers who gathered for the late-night conversations and gatherings that Joanne herself thrived within. The tension between Newman's family obligations and his growing feelings for Joanne came to a head in 1957 when the two worked together again on the film The Long, Hot Summer, an adaptation of stories by William Faulkner that gave both performers substantial roles opposite one another. Whatever restraint had defined their relationship over the preceding years began to give way during the filming of that project, and it became increasingly clear to those close to the couple that Newman's marriage to Jackie was heading toward its end. What followed was one of the more painful and drawn-out chapters of Newman's personal life, one he would later admit to feeling genuine shame about for years afterward. A divorce that Jackie refused to accept. As Newman's feelings for Joanne Woodward grew increasingly difficult to hide, he eventually worked up the courage to ask Jackie for a divorce. According to accounts from those close to the family, Jackie initially refused to sign the necessary papers, unwilling to accept the end of a marriage she had built her entire adult life around, even as the public humiliation of her husband's obvious attachment to another woman continued playing out in increasingly visible ways. For a woman who had given up her own career ambitions to support her husband and raise their children, the prospect of watching that sacrifice end in such a public and painful fashion was, understandably, almost impossible to accept without a fight. Friends of the couple later described this period as one of genuine anguish for Jackie, a stretch of months during which she continued managing a household and raising 3 young children, while her marriage publicly unraveled around her. It was only when word reached Jackie that Joanne was pregnant with Newman's child that her resistance to the divorce finally broke. Faced with the reality that her husband had already effectively started a new family, Jackie agreed to move forward with the legal separation, and the divorce was finalized in January of 1958. Newman later reflected candidly on this period of his life, admitting in interviews and in his own later writings that he considered himself too immature at the time to have made his first marriage succeed. A rare moment of public accountability from a man who otherwise guarded his private life carefully throughout his career. He would go on to describe the guilt he carried over the way his first marriage ended as something that never fully left him, even decades later, long after he had built an entirely new and, by most accounts, deeply happy life with Joanne. Just months after the divorce was finalized, Newman and Joanne married in a quiet ceremony in Las Vegas in January of 1958, beginning a partnership that would go on to define the rest of both of their lives. But for Jackie Witt, the end of her marriage marked the beginning of an entirely different chapter, one defined not by fame or public attention, but by a determined and lasting retreat into privacy that would last for the rest of her life. Life in the shadows. Following the divorce, Jackie Witter made a conscious decision to step almost entirely out of public view, choosing never to speak publicly about her marriage to Newman or the painful circumstances surrounding its end. She never returned to acting, and there is no public record that she ever remarried, instead dedicating herself fully to raising her 3 children, largely outside the media spotlight, that continued to follow her famous ex-husband throughout the following decades. She remained active in local community theatre as a hobby, and by most accounts from people who knew her personally, she was a devoted animal lover, particularly fond of dogs, finding quiet contentment in a life built around home and family rather than fame. Those who crossed paths with Jackie in the years following her divorce often remarked on just how deliberately she avoided any association with her former husband's growing celebrity, declining opportunities that might have allowed her to profit from or comment publicly on their shared history together. It was a markedly different path than many might have expected from a woman whose marriage had ended amid such public circumstances, and it reflected, by most accounts, a genuine and deeply held desire to build a life defined by her own values rather than by her connection to fame. For a woman who had once harbored her own ambitions of an acting career, The decision to step back entirely from public life reflected, in many ways, a determination to protect both herself and her children from a level of scrutiny that she had never sought out in the first place. Unlike many former spouses of major celebrities, Jackie never gave interviews about her marriage, never wrote a memoir, and never appeared to capitalize in any way on her connection to one of the most famous actors in the world. It was a choice that earned her a kind of quiet respect among those who knew her, even as it left her almost entirely absent from the historical record of Newman's otherwise extensively documented life. But the quiet life Jackie had built for herself and her children would soon be shattered by a tragedy involving her eldest son, one that would become one of the most painful chapters in the entire Newman family's history, and one that would eventually reshape how the public understood the toll of addiction on even the most privileged families in America. The son who struggled in his father's shadow. Scott Newman, the oldest of Jackie and Paul's three children, grew up attempting to carve out his own path in an industry inevitably dominated by his father's towering fame. He pursued acting himself, appearing in a handful of film and television roles throughout the 1970s, including a small part in his father's own film Slapshot. But he struggled considerably with the pressure of measuring up to a father whose name had become synonymous with movie stardom, a struggle made only more complicated by working occasionally in productions directly connected to that same famous name. That pressure, combined with the complicated emotional legacy of his parents' divorce during his own childhood, appeared to weigh on him heavily throughout his adult life, even as he attempted to build his own identity separate from his father's overwhelming shadow. Behind the scenes, Scott battled serious problems with alcohol and drug dependency throughout much of his adult life, difficulties that reportedly strained his relationship with both of his parents even as they attempted, in various ways, to help him find stability. Those who knew him during this period described a young man of genuine talent and charm, who nonetheless seemed unable to escape the cycle of substance use that increasingly came to define his daily life, a struggle that, tragically, mirrored patterns seen in many families dealing privately with addiction, regardless of wealth or fame. On November 20th, 1978, Scott Newman was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment at the age of 28, the result of what was later determined to be an accidental overdose involving a combination of alcohol and prescription medication. The loss devastated both Jackie and Paul, each of whom had, in their own ways, watched their son struggle for years without finding the lasting help he needed. For Paul Newman, already carrying guilt over the end of his first marriage and the years of complicated family dynamics that followed, the loss of his eldest son added an entirely new and profound layer of grief to his life, one that friends and biographers later suggested he never fully processed publicly, even as he continued building an extraordinarily successful career and public image in the years that followed. In the aftermath of Scott's death, Paul Newman channeled his grief into action, establishing the Scott Newman Center, an organization dedicated to educating young people about the dangers of substance abuse, a cause that remained personally important to him for the rest of his life. The organization went on to develop educational materials and programs used in schools across the country for years afterward, transforming an intensely personal tragedy into something that continued helping other families navigate similar struggles long after Scott's own death. For Jackie, however, the loss played out largely in private, consistent with the quiet, guarded life she had maintained since her divorce 2 decades earlier. She continued raising her surviving children, Susan and Stephanie, carrying this devastating loss largely out of public view, just as she had carried nearly everything else in her post-divorce life. Those who knew her during this period described a woman who bore this tragedy with quiet, private dignity, never using her son's death to seek public sympathy or attention, consistent with the same instinct for privacy that had defined nearly every aspect of her life since her marriage to Newman had ended. A quiet and unexplained ending. Jackie White lived the remainder of her life almost entirely outside the public eye, maintaining the same guarded privacy that had defined her existence since the end of her marriage decades earlier. She continued to prioritize her surviving children and grandchildren, remaining, by every available account, a devoted and loving presence in their lives, even as she steadfastly avoided any connection to the fame that continued to surround her former husband's name. As the decades passed, and Newman's celebrity only grew larger, with each new film and each new headline, Jackie's own life remained a study in contrast, quiet, private, and almost entirely undocumented by the very media apparatus that continued to follow her former husband's every move. On May 19th, 1994, Jackie Witt died in New York City at the age of 64. Her cause of death was never publicly disclosed, and no detailed obituary was ever released to the press. A final act of privacy, entirely consistent with the way she had chosen to live every year since her divorce from Newman more than 3 decades earlier. Even biographers who spent years researching Newman's life in exhaustive detail have found remarkably little documented information about Jackie's final years, a gap in the record that speaks less to any deliberate erasure and more to just how successfully she managed to keep her post-divorce life almost entirely private for the rest of her time on Earth. It was a quiet, almost invisible ending for a woman who had once been married to one of the most famous men in the world, and it left behind a story that remains, even now, one of the more mysterious and least understood chapters connected to Paul Newman's extraordinary life. While Jackie's story faded quietly into the background, the woman Newman had left her for was at that very same moment at the absolute peak of a career and a marriage that the entire world had come to admire, a partnership that would soon prove to be just as touched by heartbreak, though in an entirely different, and in some ways even more devastating, way. Building a Hollywood legend. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward's marriage quickly became one of the most admired and closely watched partnerships in all of Hollywood. Both continued building extraordinary careers throughout the following decades, frequently working together on film and television projects that showcased their remarkable chemistry both on and off screen. Woodward's career reached a defining early peak in 1957, when she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in The Three Faces of Eve, a role that required her to portray a woman experiencing multiple distinct personalities, a role widely considered one of the most demanding and celebrated performances of the decade. That award made her one of the most respected, serious actresses of her generation, a reputation she continued to build throughout the following years across a range of stage and screen roles that showcased her remarkable range. Together, Paul and Joanne welcomed 3 daughters of their own: Eleanor Teresa, known as Nell, born in 1959, Melissa Stewart, known as Lissy, born in 1961, and Claire Olivia, known as Clea, born in 1965, blending their family alongside the 3 children Newman already had from his first marriage. The couple settled into a home in Westport, Connecticut, deliberately choosing to raise their children away from the more intense spotlight of Los Angeles, a decision that reflected both of their shared desire for as much privacy and normalcy as their extraordinary fame would allow. Their Connecticut home became something of a refuge for the entire blended family, a place where Newman's children from his first marriage could also spend time, helping to gradually rebuild relationships that had been strained by the painful circumstances surrounding his divorce from Jackie years earlier. Throughout the following decades, Newman's own career soared to previously unimaginable heights, with unforgettable performances in films including Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and The Sting, cementing his status as one of the defining leading men of American cinema. He would go on to win his own Academy Award for Best Actor in 1987 for his performance in The Color of Money, a role that reunited him with the character of Fast Eddie Felson decades after his earlier, similarly acclaimed performance in The Hustler, giving him the rare distinction of an Oscar win built on a role he had first originated a full generation earlier. In 1982, Paul and Joanne together founded Newman's Own, a food company built on the surprising premise of donating all of its profits to charity, a venture that began almost as a joke among friends and eventually grew into one of the most successful charitable food brands in American history, ultimately raising hundreds of millions of dollars for causes the couple cared deeply about. What started with a homemade salad dressing recipe that Newman and a neighbor bottled and gave away as holiday gifts eventually expanded into an entire line of food products sold in grocery stores across the country, all built around the same unusual commitment to donating profits rather than keeping them, a philosophy that Newman maintained fiercely for the rest of his life. 50 years of an unbreakable bond. Despite the fame, the fortune, and the relentless public curiosity that followed them both for decades, Paul and Joanne's marriage endured in a way that few Hollywood partnerships ever managed to achieve. Friends close to the couple later acknowledged that their relationship was not without genuine difficulty, describing periods of real strain and even resentment over the years, complicated further by the guilt Newman reportedly continued to carry over the circumstances surrounding the end of his first marriage. Newman himself once described Woodward as one of the last truly remarkable people he had ever known, while she, in turn, spoke of him as an unusually thoughtful and romantic partner, a description that stood somewhat at odds with his tough, often stoic public image on screen. But whatever challenges arose between them, those closest to the couple consistently described their underlying bond as fundamentally unbreakable, a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared creative and philanthropic vision that carried them through nearly 5 decades together. They continued collaborating professionally throughout their marriage, with Newman frequently directing Woodward in projects that showcased her considerable talent, including several television and film productions that earned her further critical acclaim well into her 60s and 70s, long after many actresses of her generation had found it increasingly difficult to secure substantial roles. The couple's marriage lasted an extraordinary 50 years, an almost unheard-of achievement within an industry famous for short-lived unions, right up until Newman's health began to decline in the final years of his life. Even as both of them aged and their public appearances grew less frequent, the two remained devoted partners, continuing to collaborate on philanthropic projects and maintaining the close, private family life they had worked so deliberately to build in Connecticut, far from the pressures of Hollywood that had once threatened to consume them both decades earlier. They remained active together in supporting the Westport Country Playhouse, a historic local theatre that Newman helped revitalize, reflecting their shared, lifelong commitment to the stage that had originally brought them together as young performers decades before either of them had ever imagined the scale of fame and success that awaited them. But in 2007, tragedy arrived in a form neither of them could have anticipated, striking with a cruel and almost unbelievable timing that would forever alter the final chapter of their remarkable half-century together. A devastating double diagnosis. In 2007, Joanne Woodward, then 77 years old, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a progressive and incurable condition affecting memory and cognitive function. Just days after receiving that devastating diagnosis, Paul Newman himself was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, meaning that within the span of just a few days, the couple learned that they were both facing serious, life-altering illnesses at almost precisely the same moment. It was an almost unimaginable coincidence, Two people who had spent nearly 50 years building a life together, suddenly confronting the reality that their remaining time and their ability to fully share it with one another was about to be cut short in two entirely different but equally devastating ways. Newman, characteristically private about his health throughout his final illness, largely kept the details of his cancer diagnosis out of the press for as long as possible, continuing to make occasional public appearances connected to his charitable work even as his condition worsened. Those close to the family later described this period as one of profound difficulty for the entire household. Two life-altering diagnoses arriving almost simultaneously, forcing both Paul and Joanne, along with their children, to confront the reality of losing each other in different ways at nearly the exact same time. Paul Newman died on September 26, 2008, at his home in Westport, Connecticut, surrounded by family, at the age of 83. His death marked the end of one of the most celebrated and enduring partnerships in the history of American entertainment, and tributes poured in from across the film industry and beyond, honoring both his extraordinary career and his decades of quiet, committed philanthropic work. Fellow actors, directors, and public figures spoke of him not only as one of the greatest film stars of his generation, but as a genuinely generous and down-to-earth man whose commitment to charitable giving through Newman's Own had quietly transformed countless lives over the preceding decades. For Joanne, already navigating the earliest stages of her own illness at the time of his death, the loss of her husband of 50 years arrived at what may have been one of the cruelest possible moments, just as her own memory and cognitive abilities had already begun their slow, irreversible decline. Losing the memory of a lifetime. In the years that followed Paul's death, Joanne Woodward's condition continued its steady progression, and by most accounts from those close to the family, her memories of her husband and their remarkable life together gradually began to fade. Friends and family members have described the particular cruelty of watching someone who shared 50 years of genuine partnership slowly lose access to the very memories that defined that relationship, occasionally recalling only fragments, a sense that she had once loved someone remarkable, without being able to fully place the details of who he had been or all they had built together. People close to the family have noted that in her more lucid moments, Joanne has sometimes remarked that she once knew someone handsome and kind, without connecting that fragment of memory to the specific 50 years of history she shared with him. Joanne retreated increasingly from public life following her diagnosis, remaining at the family's home in Westport, Connecticut, under the close care of her daughters and a dedicated team of caregivers. She made her final known public appearance in 2013 at an event connected to the Serious Fun Children's Network, one of the many charitable causes she and Paul had built together over the decades, and she has not been seen in public since. Those close to the family have described her as being cared for with tremendous love and devotion by her three daughters, who have worked to ensure that despite the progression of her illness, she remains surrounded by comfort, familiarity, and family in her final years, maintaining as much continuity and warmth in her daily life as her condition will allow. It stands as a particularly heartbreaking twist for a woman whose entire life had been defined by remarkable clarity and talent. An Academy Award-winning actress capable of portraying some of the most psychologically complex characters in American film, ultimately facing a condition that would strip away her own memories piece by piece. The very qualities that made her performance in The Three Faces of Eve so extraordinary, her ability to access and portray the depths of human consciousness and identity, stand in stark and painful contrast to a disease that has slowly dismantled her own sense of self in her final years. A family legacy marked by loss. In the years since Paul Newman's death, The family he built across both marriages has continued to experience its own share of loss and complication. In August of 2025, Susan Kendall Newman, Paul and Jackie's second child, and a lifelong actress, producer, and philanthropist in her own right, died at the age of 72 from complications related to chronic health conditions. Susan had spent much of her adult life continuing her father's philanthropic legacy, working extensively on causes related to drug abuse prevention, education, and juvenile justice, carrying forward the same spirit of purposeful giving that had defined both the Scott Newman Centre and Newman's own. Her career had also included notable acting credits, including an appearance in the 1978 film I Wanna Hold Your Hand, and production work that earned her a Golden Globe Award and multiple additional nominations across her decades-long career. Her death left Stephanie as the last surviving child from Newman's first marriage to Jackie Witt, closing out yet another chapter in a family story that has, across nearly 8 decades now, been shaped again and again by both extraordinary success and profound personal loss. Meanwhile, Newman's 3 daughters, with Joanne Woodward, Nell, Lissy, and Clea, have continued caring for their mother in her advanced illness, while also working to preserve their parents' philanthropic legacy through Newman's own and the broader network of charitable causes the couple built together over more than 3 decades, even as they have occasionally clashed publicly with the Foundation's leadership over how that legacy should best be honoured and directed in the years since their father's death. 2 wives. 2 very different tragedies. Looking back across both of Paul Newman's marriages, the contrast between his 2 wives' fates is striking in its own quiet way. Jackie Witt lived out her life in almost complete privacy, carrying the pain of a very public divorce and the devastating loss of her son largely out of view, before dying in 1994 under circumstances that were never publicly explained. A woman whose entire post-Newman existence was defined by a deliberate and total retreat from the fame that had once touched her life. Joanne Woodward, by contrast, spent decades at the very centre of Hollywood's brightest spotlight, building an extraordinary career and a genuinely admired 50-year marriage, only to lose, in the cruelest possible way, her own memories of the very love story that had defined so much of her public identity. Both women, in entirely different ways, remind us that even lives defined by extraordinary fame, wealth, and public admiration are never truly protected from the kinds of pain that touch ordinary families everywhere: grief, addiction, illness, and loss. Jackie's story ended quietly, almost invisibly. A private woman who never sought the spotlight even in her final moments, her dignity and discretion intact right up until the very end. Joanne's story, meanwhile, continues even now. A woman who once captivated audiences with her extraordinary talent, living out her final years unable to fully recall the man and the life she spent 5 decades building, cared for by the very children who carry forward both her legacy and her husband's in equal measure. 2 women, 2 marriages, 2 entirely different kinds of silence at the end, and yet both, in their own way, defined by a quiet, private grace that outlasted all the noise surrounding the man they had each once loved. Decades from now, people will likely still remember Paul Newman for his piercing blue eyes, his unforgettable performances, and his surprising second act as a charitable food entrepreneur. But the fuller story, the one involving 2 women who each gave enormous parts of their lives to him, in such different ways and with such different endings, offers a far more complete and far more human picture of the man behind the legend, and of the quiet, lasting costs that even the most celebrated love stories can carry. It's a reminder that behind every carefully curated public image, there are real people carrying real grief, real sacrifice, and real love, often far away from the cameras that made one half of a marriage famous while leaving the other to live, and, eventually, to grieve almost entirely out of view. For all the glamour and mythology that surrounds a name like Paul Newman, the two women who shared his life ultimately tell a far more grounded and, in many ways, far more moving story. One about the different ways people carry love, loss, and privacy across an entire lifetime, long after the cameras have stopped rolling and the applause has faded into memory. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.